The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are listening to us. This is another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. Hopefully you have been reading along the FloridaBeerBlog.com posts that I've been putting up on a regular basis. Not going to lie, things have been a little intermittent lately. Some things have happened, and hopefully those things are now over and we can get back to posting on a regular basis. Trust me, I've got plenty of beers that I want to write about, plenty of beers that I want to talk about, plenty of stuff that we're going to be chatting about here on the podcast. And all of that is going to be updated on a more regular basis. So thank you so much for staying with me. I do appreciate it. If you are not following us, now is the time to do so. If you're on socials, we are at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter, at FL Beer Blog on the Facebook. Our websites are very easy. It's floridabeerpodcast.com and obviously the main floridabeerblog.com. We're also a very proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, and you can find them at floridapodcastnetwork.com. FPN Insiders is the closed Facebook group that you want to join if you want to stay on top of all the latest goodies and information. And trust me, you want to stay on top of all the latest goodies. Now, today is going to be, actually, let me backtrack just a little bit and say that with the Florida Beer Podcast, one of the things that producer Jemmy and I spoke about many months ago is keeping it to about half an hour an episode. And I kind of find that to be a good, manageable amount. A lot of the podcasts that I listen to are roughly half an hour to 45 minutes. It's a good length. You get the information that you need and you move on with the rest of your day. Every so often, I have an interview that will go above the 30-minute mark, and for the most part, I try to split those up into 2 episodes. So I'll let the people talk because we're having a great conversation. They have an interesting story that I just definitely want to delve deep into, and 2 episodes is perfectly good. Today's interview is part 1 of 3. And yes, our conversation really did go that long, and literally there was not a dull moment to be had during any of it. This was a conversation that I've been wanting to have for quite some time. There are several brewers here in the state of Florida that I have on my top list to talk about and talk to when it comes to the Florida Beer Podcast. Some of them have been on the podcast in short forms to talk about very specific things that are going on at their brewery, very specific events, specific releases, and other people I just have not been able to connect at all with. And one of those people is Matt Manthe. If you are familiar with the South Florida beer scene, you are very, very familiar with his current home and what he's basically been working towards his entire life. And that's Odd Breed Wild Ales. If you've never had a wild ale, this is what you may be tempted to think of as just being a sour beer. And unfortunately, just considering these to be sour beers does a great disservice to the incredible depth of knowledge that Matt Manthe has when it comes to brewing and especially microbiology. And you're going to hear from him talk about his love for brewing and his degree in microbiology, because that all has a lot to play with. So this is going to be the first of 3 episodes. We sat down with him at his brewery in Pompano Beach, Florida. If you are familiar with the area, he is literally right down the street from 26 Degree Brewing, whereas he actually did a lot of his early stuff while waiting for Odd Breed to finally open. And it was just the 2 of us. Unfortunately, he does have a kitty in the building. I saw the kitty just briefly, and then he decided to run away. Apparently, according to Matt, he likes to hang out in the roof between the ceiling tiles and the actual roof itself. So he was probably above us, but I never really got to see him. Anyway, so this is part 1 of 3 episodes with the amazing Matt Manthe from Odd Breed Wild Ales. I definitely know that you're going to do this, but enjoy. I've spoken to you, I've spoken to other brewers, and there's definitely an industry push, a love for the kettle sour. But kettle sours are not what you do. What is kind of the difference between a kettle sour and a wild ale, and why do you think the industry goes more for the former than it does the latter?
So I would say definitely complexity. If I had to sum it up in one word, I would say the complexity of the beer is completely different for a wild ale, mixed culture beer, spontaneous beer than a kettle sour. And that also has to do with, the production process. It's not just the flavor of the beer itself. I don't really like the term sour beer. I know a lot of people within my niche describe their beers as sour beers, or they call themselves a sour beer brewery. I don't really like that, in part because I feel like it implies that making a sour beer is the main goal. I look at the acidity that's produced in my beers as more of just one of the flavor components in the beer, similar to the way that you would add some acidity to, a food dish. A little bit of acidity can bring out new flavors. In the case of beer, I feel like it makes the beer more refreshing, especially in the heat, but it's not my main objective. Complexity in the beer is my main objective. And it's difficult to build that complexity in a wild beer. In any type of beer, it's difficult to build complexity, but especially I feel like when you have acidity in the mix, it's just another variable, it's another component that's giving that beer flavor, and you have to build around that. When you're making a kettle sour, it's a very quick process. It's essentially a pasteurized sour beer, and so it's typically, a 2-part fermentation where you're fermenting first with lactobacillus and you're creating acidity, and that acidity is, ideally achieved in less than 24 hours. And then you're boiling the wort to kill the lactobacillus, to kill that souring microorganism. And then you're adding a single strain of Saccharomyces. It's not a very romanticized process. It's kind of basic and straightforward. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And it makes a beer that, if done properly, can be pretty consistent. It gives you a sour beer in a couple of weeks, and that's what a lot of breweries want to do. It's definitely more cost effective. It's less risky than what I do. But personally, I just find those beers a little bit boring.
I was going to say, it seems almost like those are just a fruited wheat beer that was thrown a couple different microbes in for a couple minutes and then done. So you could have the regular version, or if you want to wait around for a week, we can have the sour version.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I had a past bartender who would describe it as like microwave cooking versus cooking something in the oven. And, it's a little bit of a crude analogy, but,
also
but
almost
not totally inaccurate.
And so why, before we get into the how, because the how is going to take some time, why did you decide, I'm not going to do that? I'm going to focus on the wild. I'm going to focus on the flavors that take years sometimes to create and explore and so on. Why spend the time when you can do something microwaved in a couple weeks and achieve what most people coming in off the street might not be able to differentiate?
Personally, I just find that kind of quicker process to be uninspiring and boring. Making good beer is a lot of work. And if I'm ultimately going to put in a lot of work to make something that I'm not proud of, that I'm not interested in, then I get bored really easily. Regardless of what type of beer you make in the brewing industry, it's tough. You put in a lot of hours. There's a lot of manual work that's involved. And if you're ultimately not pleased with that final product, what moves the needle for you? It's not going to be pay. It's, a lot of people think that brewing is a very glamorous job. Maybe about 5% of what brewers do is glamorous. It's been said by numerous people before, you're a glorified janitor. And
from what the numbers that I read once, it's 10% paperwork, 90% sanitation.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your kind of brewery and how you add all that up, but it's, it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of stuff that maybe seems like you don't really need to be very educated to do, but the devil's in the details, right? So it's like anything. I feel like you have to focus on the minutia. You have to know what is ultimately very important for you and creating your product the way that it is versus maybe what is kind of just a waste of time or otherwise, you have to learn how to focus your efforts.
Awesome. And most people have educated themselves via the old school brew at home kits, but you actually went a completely different route because you have a degree in microbiology from Auburn, if I'm correct. Clemson, sorry.
Yeah. Auburn's, I guess, kind of a rival. They're both Tigers.
But it's not like Gators, Seminoles, but still. So Clemson, I guess, what interested you in microbiology and how have you been able to take that interest into what you're doing now?
Well, when I enrolled in school, I knew that I wanted to do something in science, and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I lived in Belgium for a couple years when I was in high school, and when I was in Belgium, there was no legal drinking age. Now I
especially hate you now.
Now it's 18, but
Okay.
it's still not really a recognized legal drinking age. Not like the way it is in the U.S. and some other countries. But drinking is just part of their culture. Drinking good beer, it's not drinking to excess or anything like that. There's just a completely different approach towards alcohol, and beer is incredibly cheap in Belgium. So me being 15, 16, 17 years old, I could go into a bar and I could get a glass of Chimay for €1 or €1.50. And that was back actually when the US dollar was worth more than the euro. And so, for me and my buddies to go out and have 2 or 3 beers, and I'm spending less than $10 for a good night of entertainment, hanging out with my friends, drinking world-class beers. Yeah. I moved back to the US, and first of all, I wasn't 21 yet, but I still had an interest in beer. And I came to quickly realized that there wasn't really much great beer available, at least on the East Coast. And, this was back in about 2003, 2004. And, things have changed a lot since then. But when I was in school, I decided to change my major to microbiology because I was interested in making beer. I was originally a health science major. I use that as kind of a jumping off point because all the general education requirements were the same for my first year in school if I wanted to study science. I was aware of the microbrew scene out on the West Coast at that time. In South Carolina, I should point out at this time, they had an alcohol limit of 5% alcohol by weight for beer. Okay. South Carolina is one of 2 states in the country that defines their alcohol laws by weight. I don't recall the other one. I want to say it's Mississippi, but I could be wrong on that. But 5% by weight equates to about 6.2% by volume.
Okay, gotcha.
So we didn't have a lot of great beer in South Carolina. At that time, I believe there were only 2 or 3 breweries in the state, and 1 or 2 of those few breweries were brew pubs. The lone production brewery was Thomas Creek, which I actually ended up eventually working at. But, with an ABV limit of 6.2% for beer, we didn't get the cool microbrews in from California or Colorado, because if you're Avery or Stone, what are you going to do? Send one of your beers to South Carolina because it's under 6.2% ABV? No, it doesn't make sense. So
you're just going to ignore the entire market.
So me and my buddies, we would get some good beer from North Carolina, where they did have a higher ABV limit on beer. But I started homebrewing when I was in college, in part because I knew I wanted to get into beer, and also I wanted to make sure that this was, in fact, what I wanted to do.
Awesome. And at what point, I guess, which of the 2 influences, your time in Belgium or your interest in microbiology, which one of those veered you towards the kind of beers that you're producing today?
Oh man, that's a tough question, because to a certain extent, I feel like those 2 influences are equal. The beers that I make here at Odd Breed, they're Belgian style beers. A lot of people, I feel like, don't maybe recognize that or even agree with me on that. Certainly a lot of the beers that I make are not a traditional Belgian style such and such, but they're all inspired by Belgian style sour beers, primarily to a certain extent, old school Saisons. A lot of people, I think, today don't realize that historically Saisons were either very bitter or they were pretty sour. And part of that was because there was just this natural inclusion of lactic acid bacteria in the beers. And they could prevent the beer from turning sour by adding a lot of hops, which of course would in turn make the beer very bitter. Or they embraced the idea that the beer was going to be sour and didn't add a lot of hops to it. And so, I primarily make the beers, I guess, that are those sour versions of Saisons. But I also do some darker, sour beers that are more inspired by Flanders Red, by Oud.
Your Oud Bruin is still my absolute favorite.
Thank you.
And when that comes around,
appreciate it.
I need just an entire puncheon of it. Just roll it up to my house if you could.
That'd be a little hard, but it might be a way to do that.
It has your time in Belgium or the styles that you brew continue to influence you, for certain things. Cause like, as we were talking about the puncheons and as you're talking about the size of the brews and whatnot, all the numbers that you're doing are in metric and not imperial, which most of the breweries around here do. Is that just a function of the recipes and where, I guess, the people that are talking about it just happen to be over there and are thinking and writing in metric? Or is that just something that you've held on to, since your time and your development yourself?
I would say it's a little bit of both. So, I lived in Belgium for 2 years. I also lived in Berlin for 7 months. I went to brewing school out there. But studying microbiology, the metric system is the language of science, right? And so I use both systems. A lot of it is based on my equipment. And so the puncheons, the large barrels that I age in, they're 500 liters. That's equal to 132 gallons. I essentially do a 20 hectoliter batch of beer. So I fill up 4 puncheons. It's, to put that in perspective, that's about 550 gallons of beer per batch that I brew. After losses and transfers and everything, I end up with somewhere around 520 gallons. But I use both systems kind of interchangeably. When I was in brewing school, everything was metric. And so certain things that I had done in South Carolina when I was working at Thomas Creek, was almost entirely in gallons and Fahrenheit and degrees Lovibond, not EBC, which is what they use in Europe, which is just another unit for measuring color. And so The way that I do my calculations, I find a lot of things. I actually do the calculations in the metric system, and then I transfer them back if it's something that I'm just maybe more familiar with using.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you're in South Carolina, you're at Thomas Creek, you're doing a lot of that stuff. Are you originally from South Florida, or what ended up eventually bringing you to Boca, the next stage of your kind of beer journey?
Yeah, so I've lived all over the place. My dad was in the Marine Corps when I was growing up, and so I was born in Northern Virginia. I lived there less than a year, then moved to California. I was out there for 4 years, then moved to Maryland, then Kansas, then Hawaii, then Rhode Island, then Belgium, then South Carolina. I was in South Carolina for my senior year of high school. I went to 3 high schools, one in Rhode Island, one in Belgium, and then one in South Carolina. Went to school in the upstate of South Carolina at Clemson, and then I worked at Thomas Creek for almost 3 years after I graduated from Clemson. I started as the assistant brewer there, eventually worked my way up to head brewer, and I knew that I wanted to go to brewing school, so I went to VLB out in Berlin, and that's where I received my brewmaster's diploma in brewing and malting science. And then after that, I kind of wanted to move to Florida. So I've had family that's lived in the Tampa Bay area and Orlando. So I would periodically visit them, while I was growing up. So I felt like I had some connections to the state. Okay. I like warm weather. And also I had felt that Florida had an underdeveloped beer scene, and yet a high population, dense population in certain areas. A lot of people that have moved here from other parts of the country and are familiar with microbreweries and good beer. And so I felt like moving down here just made a lot of sense. I initially moved to St. Petersburg, actually, when I moved back from Germany. I was working for Greenbench as a consultant. So I lived in St. Pete for about 4 months. And I moved over to this coast because I got a call from Fran Andrulevich. And Fran was the longtime brewer at Bruzy in Boca. He's also one of the co-owners of the brand Inlet Brewing, which makes Monk in the Trunk. Monk in the Trunk is a contract brew that used to be made anyway at Thomas Creek. And so I knew Fran back from when I was brewing at Thomas Creek. Gotcha. And he called me up one day to tell me about the job opening at Bruzy. I decided to move over, in part because I wanted to open this project. And I felt like working at the brew pub, which is Bruzy was a 15-barrel brew pub. It was a solo operation, so I could set my own hours. Yeah. And there was no distribution compared to what I was used to, working 70-plus hours a week as head brewer, six, sometimes 6.5 days a week, to be in a brew pub environment and work in air conditioning and only sell directly, at the bar.
Gorgeous kind of on-stage brewery, copper jacketing and everything.
Yeah. I was able to do decoctions. I had a lot of creative control there.
Well, that's a good question, because I've spoken to other brewmasters at other brew pubs, and they've said, there are a couple taps that they have, that they're able to do whatever they want to and have, a lot of creative freedom. But for the most part, they're brewing the same recipes over and over and over again because the people that are coming in, they know the wheat ale, they know the pale ale, they know the porter, and they need to have that on tap. And so that was most of what they were doing. Whereas you're saying at Brewsy, you had a good amount of freedom. How much space did you have to do the things that you wanted to do to sort of, I guess, proto odd breed? And then how much of it was, we're doing the same Brewsy recipes over and over again?
No, I had pretty much complete creative control. And so when I started at Brewsy, they had been in business about 15 years. I was only the third brewer there. And so the first brewer didn't even last a year. Fran was there forever. And so when I took over, there were the established flagships, and I slowly made those recipes my own, making slight adjustments the way that I felt they should be made, and otherwise just putting my kind of creative stamp on them. But we had 8 taps, and we had 3 beers that were intended to always be on. And that was a Boca Blonde, which is a Munich Helles, did a single decoction on that, did a Vienna lager called City Fest, and then did a Schwarzbier called Black. Eventually, I transitioned the Black Duke into being a Baltic Porter. The reason being that it's really tough to sell a 15-barrel batch of a dark lager in Boca, and it's only for that brew pub. And so it would take me about 6 months usually to sell a batch of Black Duke. And the problem is the last 3 months or so that beer was on draft, I just wasn't proud of it. It was too old. It's a style that I feel like relies on freshness. When I transitioned the recipe to a Baltic Porter, the beer only sold a little bit faster, but it was a style that aged so much better. And so I felt like the entire time it was on draft, it at least tasted better. And so the other 5 taps, though, I could play around with. And so as long as I had those 3 main beers on draft, I could do whatever I wanted really with those other 5. And so occasionally I would make, some other German lagers, but I made a lot of Brett beers there. And
well, and how did that land? Because this is a question that I'm obviously going to be asking again when we talk about Pompano Beach, but you talk about Boca, and, obviously the joke is that it's God's waiting room. Right? And I've had relatives that have lived in Boca myself. They have since passed on. Drum roll here. How much of a balancing act was it to do the things that you wanted to do, to kind of push the envelope with what you could in terms of brewing, but also make a product that was actually going to sell with a very particular audience that Boca and Lower Palm Beach County is?
Sure. It was interesting. And it was at times definitely a challenge because I wanted to make these certain types of beer that no one else in the area was making. And so there was a lot of, or at least on my part, there was the attempt at teaching people about these styles. I found that, oddly enough, a lot of people seemed to like these Brett beers that I was making, some of these unusual, obscure styles. I did a German style Stickult. I did a Grodziski. I think I was the first one in Florida to brew a Grodziski. And, nobody knew what this low ABV Polish style smoked wheat beer was, but they thought it tasted kind of like barbecue. And, and that makes it kind of interesting. But I found that a lot of people, they didn't understand what Brett was. They didn't understand that Brett was a wild yeast. They were aware that these beers that I was making tasted kind of unusual, but they had a unique sort of fruitiness or tropical sort of flavor, even though there weren't any fruits involved. And it was a bit of a challenge to get people to understand them, but surprisingly, they sold better than I would have expected, which is why I kept making them.
Interesting. I'm going to pause your history for one brief moment and ask a question about Brett, since it seems to be an ingredient that you see a lot of, especially in more the sour beers that you're finding in other locations, people that list it as sour. In your opinion, in the craft beer industry, are people using Brett the way that it should be used?
Usually no, in my opinion. Yeah, that's a good question. And so when I say that, what I mean is that a lot of people approach Brett as though it's just like some kind of variant of Saccharomyces. And what I mean by that is that, most brewers, they purchase their yeast from any one of the dozen or so yeast labs around the country, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. The thing is, Brettanomyces in the lab performs completely different than Brettanomyces does when it's in your brewery. And so, I refer to Brettanomyces that you purchase from a lab as being kind of pampered and spoiled and hasn't had any experience out in the real world yet. It doesn't know what it's like living on the streets. It doesn't attenuate usually as highly. If you get it directly from a lab, it's slower working. And the same thing is especially true with lactic acid bacteria, especially Pediococcus, which is the type of souring bacteria that I use in my beer. But, once you kind of develop your own Brettanomyces strain and or your own souring bacteria strain, once it's allowed to evolve in your brewery environment, it, I think, becomes a lot more consistent, more predictable. In my early days of doing beers with Brettanomyces, I would notice that, I could produce beers with a really high level of consistency regarding more mainstream typical styles. But when I would make, say, my Brett Pale Ale recipe, and I would get those Brettanomyces strains directly from the lab, the beer didn't always ferment the same way. It didn't always attenuate the same way. And it would be a little bit frustrating in that I felt like everything else that I had made was pretty predictable, except these beers. And that challenge also, I think, was a really unique opportunity to see, all right, well, why is it behaving this way? What can I learn about this process, this ingredient? How can I make this beer better and more predictable? And ultimately, I kind of found out that, you got to, store these strains in-house. When they're stored in a laboratory, when they're grown on nutrient agar, they behave completely differently when you then throw them in a fermenter for the first time versus when you harvest them from a beer fermentation and you reuse them. You're essentially teaching that strain what you want it to do. If you're not happy with the results, you're not reusing that strain from that particular fermentation. And so I like to joke around, that every time I reuse my mixed culture here at Odd Breed, it gets better because I've given it feedback. I've told it, hey, you performed well. I'm going to let you grow in this beer now,
This is going to be the silliest question I've ever asked on this podcast. Can you exhaust yeast? Is there a certain time it's like, okay, you've done your work. I
Sure.
can't get anything else out of you. It's time for you to go.
Yeah, you definitely can. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do also with just what you're taking that yeast off of, So Brettanomyces will live for a really long time. I mean, if it's in the right sort of environment, it can stay alive for decades. And, it's obviously going to be different under those types of conditions, but I wouldn't want to harvest my yeast and bacteria out of a barrel that's, say, 3 years old.
So there we are. I was actually able to try a number of the beers at Brewzy a couple times before it closed, unfortunately. I do believe that the location, or at least part of it, is now a Starbucks, which is par for the course in our modern society. Next week, we're going to be coming back with part 2, in which we're going to talk about the beers a little bit more and eventually finding his new home where we were sitting in Pompano Beach. Make sure to come back for that. Do think it's a lot of great information that is still coming up, and we are definitely excited to have you join us on the next episode. Intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pacala. Our executive producer and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Lagonier. Florida Beer Podcast is a very proud member of the Florida Podcast Network. Make sure to follow them at floridapodcastnetwork.com or on FPN Insiders on Facebook. Remember to follow us on Facebook at FL Beer Blog. We are Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter. And obviously our websites are floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com. This is Dave, your host and author. We will be back next week for part 2 of our interview with Manthe. In the meantime, enjoy, crack open a beer, and drink Florida craft.